Hylomorphism is a version of soul theory in that it says that there is more to us than just our bodies. There is more to us than just our minds. There is more to us than just biological or psychological continuity. There is a further fact. There is a further immaterial part that you have. There is a further condition that needs to be met in order for you to be the same over time. By virtue of being a soul theory or a further fact theory, hylomorphism has an added burden of proof. In order to show that it is a better view than the more reductionist views, such as the psychological approaches and the biological approaches, it has to have some overwhelming advantages over those views that make it worth introducing the idea of an immaterial part of a soul. If it has only some advantages, right? If it can only do some things that the other views cannot, we might think that that's not reason enough to bring in this entirely different thing, this immaterial part, this immaterial soul. And so what I want to do in this video is try to give my summary presentation on why I think hylomorphism actually does provide so many advantages over other views that we should think that it is the correct theory of the human person. And if it is the correct theory of the human person, that means that we have an indirect, sort of abductive argument for thinking that we do indeed have souls in addition to our bodies, that there is more to us than both our bodies and our minds, and more to our identity over time than just biological and psychological continuity. It's a sort of abductive argument. It's an argument to the best explanation. The idea is that given the number of puzzles and arguments and worries for various theories of the human person that we've seen throughout this course, we should think that the view that solves the most amount of puzzles with the least amount of counterintuitive implications, we should think that that one is the one that's most likely to be right, whatever its other commitments are. So that's what I'll try to argue is the case for hylomorphism. So what I want to do in this video is finally put all the pieces together and run through the full chart of the hylomorphic view of the human person, which the chart that we've been doing for all the theories of the human person. We should be able to specify who are the notable proponents of this view. What does this view say that we are? And what does our identity consist on this view? What are some various implications of this view? Practical, ethical. What are the best arguments for this view, and what are the most significant arguments against this view? By looking at the whole chart, we'll now be in a position to compare this whole chart to the charts of the other views and to see which view of the human person does the best on all of these criteria compared to the others. So let's run through the chart then. Hylomorphism is the view championed by Aristotle, by St. Thomas Aquinas, by other medieval Aristotelians, but we've just focused on St. Thomas's view. And in contemporary debates, Patrick Toner and David Oderberg are the people that we've read. So I'm just listing here the proponents that we've read. We've read from Aristotle, St. Thomas, Patrick Toner, and David Oderberg. We also read a little bit from John Haldane. We'll read a little bit from Jason Eberl later on. But those are the main proponents, both in terms of who set up the view early on, Aristotle and St. Thomas, but also who have made contemporary versions of the view and inserted them into the contemporary debate. So what are we according to hylomorphism? Well, we've talked about this in a couple different ways so far. According to hylomorphism, a human person is a rational animal. It is a rational, sentient, living, natural, corporeal substance. A human person is composed, like other material objects, of both matter and form. And because it is a substance, it is composed of prime matter and substantial form. And because it is a living substance, it is composed of body and a soul. And the particular kind of living substance that we are means that we are composed of body and rational soul. The other way to get at this is to focus on the category of person and narrow it down to understanding what a human person is. A person is an individual substance of a rational nature, and a human person, to be distinguished from immaterial persons such as angels, demons, and God, the three persons in God. A human person is an individual substance of a rational, sentient nature, having also the capacity for sense perception. So those are the three ways of specifying what we are according to the hylomorphic worldview. We are rational animals, we are composites of body and rational soul, and we are individual substances of a rational, sentient nature. Now, in what does our identity consist? What makes us the same over time on this view? Well, it is a version of soul theory. So it is true that sameness of soul is necessary for your existence over time. Biological and psychological continuity are not enough. You also need the further fact of whether we're dealing with the same soul. But here, right after, beyond that, all forms of hylomorphism will agree with that. But there are two forms of hylomorphism that might disagree on whether the sameness of the soul is also a sufficient condition, a sufficient criterion. According to hylomorphic animalism, as explained by Patrick Toner, sameness of soul is necessary, but it is not sufficient for the identity of the person. The person, in order for it to be the same person over time, it also requires a suitable body. So even if your soul survives, it wouldn't be enough to be you. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the hylomorphic approach to the afterlife. But on hylomorphic dualism, championed by David Oderberg, the sameness of soul is both necessary and sufficient for the identity of the person. The person can continue to exist even after having lost his or her body. Body is not a necessary part, a necessary condition on hylomorphic dualism, whereas on hylomorphic animalism it is. If there is a difference between those two approaches, that's where the difference lies. This is the main difference between Toner's approach and Oderberg's approach. All the other differences are mainly ones of emphasis. Now, what are some various implications of this view? What if hylomorphism were the right view? What would that mean? Well, one implication of the view is that there could not be more than one soul in your body at a time. Here we get from the unicity doctrine. We also have the no substantial parts doctrine, which means that none of your parts pre-existed you, none of your parts could survive without you, and that no part survives your death. We saw that this is a potentially really strongly counterintuitive implication, but we also saw that it does some really important work for hylomorphism in helping it to solve various puzzles about the nature of the human person. Toner also argues that one of the implications of hylomorphism is that anything that belongs to our biological species is a rational animal and thus a human person. He also thinks that on hylomorphism, I could survive falling into a persistent vegetative state. I was once a fetus. I wouldn't go with my cerebrum, but I would stay behind with a living human organism. Toner thinks that I do cease to exist at death. I could never become a dead body, and my surviving soul isn't enough to be me, whereas Oderberg thinks that I could survive my death and the loss of my body by virtue of the survival of my soul. One further implication that is sort of worth emphasizing here that I didn't emphasize in any of the earlier videos is that according to Toner, right, so there's this question about, well, if we're rational animals, any member of our species, Homo sapiens, is a rational animal and thereby a human person. What about the potential for rational creatures of other biological species? What if we find intelligent Martians or intelligent creatures on other planets? What if we find out that some creatures here on Earth are actually way smarter than we thought, that actually do fulfill the conditions for rationality? Would that mean that there are multiple species of rational animals and that we're only one of the species of a rational animal? We're only one kind of rational animal? Here's what Toner says. Toner says, actually, that rational animal is the category to which we belong, but that it would incorporate any other members of any other species that fulfill two conditions, that have the capacity for sense perception, but also have the capacity for rationality in the same way that we do. So what that would mean is that if we found intelligent creatures on other planets, it wouldn't mean, right, that there are rational animals of one type and there are rational animals of the other type, that the human persons would only be one kind of rational animal. What Toner says is that if we could find such creatures, then they would count as rational animals in the same sense as us, and they would thereby be human persons. You might think that he's wrong about that. So the idea that you discover more intelligent creatures, it doesn't challenge the category to which we belong, it just expands it. It just means there's more entities that are like us in their essential kind than we thought. Okay, so those are some various implications of hylomorphism. As we go forward in the course and we look at beginning of life issues, end of life issues, and issues pertaining to the afterlife, we'll also look at some other potential implications of this view. But for now, those are the main ones that we have discussed. But now let's talk about the main arguments that can be given in favor of hylomorphism. I've talked about some of these so far, but now I want to put all the pieces together. And I've got a nice list on this chart if you've got it in front of you. Hylomorphism is essentially built on three principal claims: that we are animals, that we have souls, and that our souls are really distinct from our bodies and perhaps could even survive without them. So what sort of arguments can the hylomorphist give for thinking that we are animals? Well, it can use as a weapon, right? It can use Eric Olson's thinking animal argument. It can use that against any other view that says we're not animals. It can also use St. Thomas's I am that which perceives and that which thinks argument for against any view that says that we're only the thing that thinks or we're the thing that perceives. What about arguments for thinking that we have souls? So hylomorphism can use all of the arguments that animalists have for thinking that we are animals and that the animal is the one and only thinker of your thought. So bring in all of those. Hylomorphism can use all of them. What about the claim that we have souls? What sort of arguments can the hylomorphist bring in for thinking that this is true? I list three reasons or three arguments that a hylomorphist can bring in for thinking that we do have souls. The first argument would be something like the etymological argument or the argument by definition. This is to bring in the general hylomorphic framework. On the general hylomorphic framework, living things have souls by definition. The soul is, in this framework, just whatever it is that makes the matter into a living thing. It is the principal difference between living and non-living things. And so that we have souls is something that just falls out of the way that hylomorphism understands its terms. I don't think that's a particularly forceful argument, but it is one of the reasons that the hylomorphist can give for thinking that we're souls. Introduce the larger framework in which that makes sense to say. A second argument that hylomorphists can bring in arguing that we have souls, in other words, that there's more to us beyond our matter, beyond our bodies, is this issue of perfect identity. I introduced this as an argument that substance dualists can use. The general idea is you might think that, well, look, nothing can really be the same over time unless it has at least one part that remains the same throughout. But look at your psychological states. None of your mental states seem to stay the same over the whole of your existence. Not your memories, not your beliefs, not your character traits. And so none of those can serve that purpose of making you literally the same over time. But I'll also look at your particular material parts. It looks like none of those remain the same. They tell us that after every 7 years, you have cycled through all of your material parts, such that none of them that you once had are now a part of you. So it doesn't look like there's any material part that stays the same. It doesn't look like there's any psychological part that stays the same. And so you might think that the only way to get some part that remains the same over time is to introduce the idea of a soul. And if you think that the only way for something really strictly numerically to be the same is for it to have at least one part that remains the same throughout, which is something that Aristotle himself seems to recognize. This is why he's introducing the notion of form, one of the reasons for why he's introducing the notion of form. Then why bring in souls? Because it can get us the sort of perfect identity that it seems that we human persons have. It looks like we human persons are the same over time, not just by convention, but really, metaphysically. And so in order to get that, you might think that you need to bring in something else besides the psychology and the biology. You might need to bring in a soul. The last argument that I can think of the hylomorphists can bring in to think that we have souls is Swinburne's argument that in order to account for certain fission cases, we need to bring in this further fact in order to make it the case that either one of the branches or neither one of them is you. What Swinburne argues is that the biological facts and the psychological facts can't alone tell you or account for what happens to you in such cases. In order to give an account, which we think there ought to be such an account, that there ought to be an answer to what happens to me, he thinks you need to bring in some further fact, some soul. And hylomorphists can borrow that strategy just as well. So far what I've got are some arguments that hylomorphism can give for thinking that we are animals and for thinking that we have souls. In general, what I want to say is that for these two claims, the hylomorphists, in support of the fact that we're animals, can bring in all of the great resources that standard animalism has for arguing for this view. And that we have souls, I think hylomorphists can bring in all of the great resources that substance dualists or other soul theorists have for concluding that we do indeed have souls. So hylomorphism doesn't have to come up with its own unique arguments for the main tenets of the position. It can bring in all of the great arguments from the other views, though it can add its own. As we've seen, Aquinas adds the I am that which perceives and that which thinks argument in favor of animalism. And it brings in the general hylomorphic framework in support of the claim that we do indeed have souls. So it can borrow all the arguments from the other views, but it can also introduce its own, as we've seen Aristotle and Aquinas do. But what about the further claim that not only is there this further immaterial part, but that our souls are really distinct from our bodies? This is something really immaterial and something different from the matter and the body. We talked about a couple different ways in which you might try to argue for the immateriality of the intellect. For some reason to think that something about consciousness or our minds that are really distinct from our brains. I talked about the nature or the argument from qualia, that there's something about the subjective feel of consciousness that cannot be easily identified with what's going on in the brain. Then I also talked about Aquinas' emphasis on our ability to form these universal concepts, his master argument and the storage argument and the argument from ontological mismatch in support of premise 2 of that argument, that there is some operation or activity that you perform that isn't actually using any part of your body, which is reason to think that there is some part of you that is really distinct and in some way separable from your body. And so there are various arguments for thinking that not only is there something more to us than body and soul, there is something more to us than our body and our minds, but that this immaterial fact is something really distinct and maybe even separable. And so here too, I think Hylomorphism can bring in some of the resources that are in substance dualism for arguing for this third claim, but also can bring in its own arguments, as we saw Aristotle and Aquinas do. So I think that Hylomorphism has some pretty good arguments in favor of its three main claims, that we are animals, that we have souls, and that our souls are really distinct, that our minds, that our souls are really distinct from our bodies. And then I also talked about last time about not only does it have pretty good arguments in support of those claims, it also has various advantages over other views that are committed to similar claims. So let me just rehearse once more some of the main advantages over the other views that I identified last time. Two main advantages that hylomorphism has over substance dualism is that it explains the relationship better between body and soul, and so it seems to avoid the causal interaction and pairing problems. And it also seems to have fewer epistemic or epistemological concerns, in that biological continuity can serve as evidence for presence and persistence of rational soul, because you can't have a human body without a rational soul, and you can't have the same human body without the same rational soul. So, advantage hylomorphism over substance dualism? Perhaps. What about the advantages over animalism? Here I talked about that hylomorphism does offer a reply to the corpse problem or the dead body problem. It says that death is a substantial change, and like other substantial changes, everything that comes after is entirely new. This shouldn't be surprising for the hylomorphist, whereas it was for the standard animalist. The unicity doctrine also, as we've seen, allows hylomorphism to give a new reply to the thinking parts or the rival candidates problem. Why? Because none of your parts are themselves substances, and so they have to be merely instruments or the means by which the one substance, the animal, performs its various actions. I think hylomorphism also does a better job, as we talked about last time, of preserving our moral value at all times. You are always rational, even in your fetal stage, even in the vegetative state. You are always rational in the sense of having a rational nature, of having the sort of substantial form that gives you a developmental trajectory toward developing overt rational capacities, even if something gets in the way, such as injury or defect or something preventing it from the outside. And in that respect, we are always persons, even in the moral sense, according to Toner, at every stage of our existence. Another potential advantage over animalism that I mentioned last time is that it gives a further fact that we can use to help us solve various fission cases. And then finally, you might think that this is an advantage, that hylomorphism, because it has this further thing, this soul, which is in some sense separable from the body, you might think that this makes the possibility of surviving your bodily death much more possible, much more plausible. It looks like it's going to be more possible for you to survive your death according to hylomorphism than it is on standard animalism. You might think that's an advantage. You might just think that's something that is a nice upshot of the view. Maybe not by itself an argument for thinking that it is a better view than standard animalism. Whether standard animalism can account for something like the possibility of an afterlife is something that we'll talk about later on when we do the afterlife stuff. It's a really cool discussion about how animalists are trying to get something like the possibility of an afterlife. Okay, so putting that all together then, I think there can be made a pretty strong cumulative case for why hylomorphism is perhaps the best view of the human person on offer. It has various advantages over animalism. It has various advantages over substance dualism. It has the same advantages over the psychological approach that animalism does, but it can also preserve something important about our psychological capacities, which standard animalism cannot. It brings in further facts to help us solve various puzzles about personal identity, but without bringing in the problems that substance dualism does. In some ways, and if you catch me on the right day, I'll say that all of this, right, this cumulative case is a persuasive sort of case for thinking that hylomorphism is the right theory of the human person. It just does better than any other view with respect to all of the puzzles, with respect to all the desiderata, all the things that we want out of a theory of the human person. And putting all of these points together, you get something like, it's not a knockdown argument, but it's like, look, it has all of the best pros and very few cons. If I were to take a step back, and if I were to, as I said in class the other day, if I were to give if I had like the elevator speech, if someone asked, well, why do you think hylomorphism is the right theory of the human person? Well, that's interesting. Not too many people hold that view today. But why do you think that view is kind of surprising? It seems sort of like an antiquated view. Isn't that the view of like Aristotle and Aquinas? Why would anyone hold that view? Why do you think that's the right approach to the human person? If I had just sort of a few minutes to explain it, if I had a long period of time, I'd give this whole chart. I'd explain the whole cumulative case for hylomorphism. But if I had just a few minutes to explain, here's probably the way that I would explain what appeals to me about hylomorphism. I think that hylomorphism as a theory of the human person captures really two really crucial elements that I think are important for understanding the human person better than any other view. And I think these two components, these two aspects of the human person that I think are really important to capture, and which hylomorphism captures better than any other view, are our vulnerability, but also our dignity. Like animalism, I think hylomorphism captures the idea that we are vulnerable creatures, that we are fallible, that we can be damaged, that we can be diseased, that we can fail, that we can be distracted, that we can be handicapped. One of the things that I worry about with the psychological approach is that on that approach, it seems like you're only you when you are firing on all cylinders. You are only you when you are at your best. When you suffer a kind of damage to some of your psychological capacities, you are not you in sort of a more vulnerable or endangered sort of state. You are no longer you at all. You are gone. Whereas animalism and hylomorphism, by having some aspects is similar to that of animalism, I think properly captures our vulnerability as human creatures. We are not always, and very rarely, at the top of our game, really firing and living up to all our capacities. We fail. We can be damaged. We can be handicapped in various ways, and yet still be us. It's part of our nature to be fallible and to be vulnerable, and I think hylomorphism does a nice job of capturing that. Unlike, let's say, maybe some psychological approaches, and unlike, let's say, maybe some versions of substance dualism. But the other aspect of the human person that I think hylomorphism does a really nice job to capture is not just our vulnerability, but our dignity. There is something special and unique about the kind of thing that we are. And at every stage of our existence, there is some tremendous moral value to be found in that thing that we are. This is something that I think animalism doesn't do as good of a job with. As Olson says, right, it might have been you as the fetus, but who cares, right? Maybe that thing didn't have any kind of moral status, right? It was completely dumb, didn't have any sort of interesting psychological capacities. Yeah, it was you, but who cares, right? It was something that didn't have a whole lot of interesting features or value. Whereas the psychological approach really wants to preserve what's unique about us, right? They build it into their metaphysical account of the human person. We are so unlike other creatures that we're not even sort of the flesh and blood. We are distinct from our bodies in some way. We are not the animal. We are somehow related to the animal. What I think the psychological approach is trying to capture is that there is something unique about the kind of thing that we are, and there is something of tremendous moral value in the sort of thing that we are. And I think that hylomorphism does a better job of capturing that aspect than standard animalism, insofar as it grounds right in our identity, our rational nature, right? Our personhood right into the very fabric of our being, right into the nature of the sort of thing that we are. And so if someone were to ask me, well, why do you think hylomorphism is the right view of the human person? What is it about hylomorphism that you like? That it preserves both our vulnerability and our dignity as human persons. I think a view of the human person really has to capture both of those aspects. And some of them capture the one better than the other, some of them capture the other better than the one. But I think hylomorphism, better than any other view, really captures both of those elements and builds them right into the account. And so at the end of the day, that's why I find hylomorphism as a theory of the human person so intriguing, so captivating. It's what I think makes it worth further exploration and further defense, even if the cumulative case isn't sort of compelling and persuasive to everyone. I think it's enough to show that hylomorphism is a serious competitor in the contemporary debate and ought to be treated as such. Often it isn't put on the same level as animalism and the psychological approaches, or even substance dualism. But I think it ought to be for the reasons that I've given on this chart. And so on some days, I'll say that this resolutely shows that hylomorphism is the best view. More modestly, I would say that this shows that hylomorphism is a serious competitor, and one that we ought to take seriously in the contemporary debates. But the last thing I want to talk about, and I'll talk about this in the next video, is, okay, there's all the good about hylomorphism. There are the main reasons for why I think it has a lot going for it. But why doesn't everybody accept hylomorphism? Why, right, given that you've presented such a strong cumulative case, Dr. S., why haven't you convinced everyone? I think partly because there are some serious worries or concerns or possible objections to hylomorphism. I think that the success of hylomorphism will depend a lot on how well it does with these objections. And I think there's serious objections. They're ones that have bothered me for quite a while, and some of them were sort of the inspiration for my continuing to work on this stuff, for writing my master's thesis, for writing my dissertation. And so I want to introduce those because I think it'd be fair to really spend some time talking about why other people might not be persuaded by hylomorphism and what sort of problems it really has to contend with if it really wants to persuade other people that it is the right view. So that's what we'll talk about next time.